Hey church family, this is part 2 of our racial reconciliation panel. We believe at Living Stones that God has called all people of every tribe, nation, language, and tongue and ethnicity to worship Him, and He's called us in Christ to be brothers and sisters united together in peace. And so that's what this panel is going to discuss today.
Can I just say that I am like physically not feeling well. Right? And so when I think about community as an umbrella, it is just daunting. And I get very concerned about messages getting lost. Because even as I sit here and engage in the conversation, and when I hear it, I don't want people to go, well, you're a Christian, so you shouldn't be worried about this, because I've heard that, right? And, well, you're in this position, so you shouldn't be worried about this. And the conversation around race and ethnicity is a real conversation. And I think because people are in so much pain in so many different places and so many levels of frustration that we cannot hear each other. And I'm not in the vein of when people are like this about the police. I have wonderful friends in law enforcement. I have wonderful families in law enforcement. And that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 1,500 police officers that do something damage the entire force. And it's very similar to what happens to the Black community. If 1 or 2 people have had a bad experience with a Black individual, it demonizes the entire community. And so what people need to understand is I should not have to walk into a room and wear my resume for you to hear me. And I shouldn't have to convince you not to fear me. And nor should my son have to be in this space. And if you can't enter into that dialogue and hear those lived experiences and talk about what's happening in our organizational structures and systems, we are not going to get to reconciliation. There are some very real things that are here on this table that is so much easier to just slide aside because that is way too uncomfortable and we just want to move on. And I continue to say to people, we cannot move on if we don't move through. And if you're not willing to lean into this, we can't get through it.
Thank you so much for bringing some context to this dialogue and this conversation, because we want to make sure the message does not get lost, and that if, and this is what I want to say to you, like if you're hearing something, I want to say don't disconnect, you know, and that's why when I first started, I'm encouraging you to listen and to get informed and to get deeply informed and hear, so we can get other angles and perspective, that we may have some fruitful and healthy dialogue around this topic and this discussion. And Jill, that leads me to you. I want to ask you a question.
Actually, I'd love to add on to that, because I'm so grateful for you bringing that to this table, that discussion about racism is evil. Prejudice, discrimination is evil, and we have a responsibility to call it that. It is evil. We also need to be careful that we don't commit the same sin of a hasty generalization and a stereotype of all groups are this and all groups are that, right? That all police are this, and all Black people are that, and all white people are this, and all politicians are that, and all, you know, whenever we do that, a stereotype is a stereotype is a stereotype, no matter what group we attach it to. But what we have an opportunity to do right now is for everybody to come together and call out what is evil, which is racism and racial discrimination and racial injustice and inequality. And that is where we can see change on the individual level and on the structural level. And so on an individual level, it's as intimate as sitting in each other's offices and having honest conversations, listening to each other, repenting, being humble, hearing each other, reflecting and changing ourselves and the way we relate to one another. And then on a structural level, it's looking at policies and what are some things that we have not addressed that have just been there forever and need to be restructured. And so thank you for that.
And what I would add to the policy conversation is that if we're going to diversify our networks and diversify our organizations, we've got to diversify the people that are at the table. And so that means a commitment from the community to get involved and get on committees and run for office and get in places. Because if you look at who's on the ground fighting and pushing, and then you look at who's in position to make decisions, it is a stark difference. And so we've got to be better as a whole system, not just we, black people and white people, and we've got to get in position, but we also need the people in position to take a real long look around the room and notice who's missing and really start to work on shifting and systemically changing some things.
Absolutely. Thank you. I had another thought for you, Jill. I completely forgot it. All right. So I'm just going to move on to this next question that we have for you. Where does racial inequality exist in the state of Nevada, and what has been done about it, and what more can we do?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I wear a couple different hats. We were talking about that beforehand, how which titles are we going to use? And I am a citizen, I'm a follower of Christ, I'm a mom, I'm a member of this community, but I also am somebody who's taught at the University of Nevada Communication Studies, and we have these conversations every semester in every one of my classes, and taught at TMCC for 5 years, taught at UNR for 16 years, and then I also represent in the state legislature, in the assembly, and serve on judiciary, serve on education, serve on commerce and labor. And there are still inequities that exist today. So I can speak for, we can do this for an entire weekend, a 3-day retreat. When I saw your list of questions, I said, is this gonna be a 13-hour panel? Is this gonna be, we have so many layers to this. So let me say a couple things that are good, because I think it is important to recognize what's good at the state level. To your point about voices, we are the most diverse legislature in the nation, and we made US history. This last legislative session as being the first female majority, and we have unbelievable representation to the top, to our Speaker Frierson, who I greatly respect, who I adore, as even though we don't always share the same positions on things, I trust him. We can have dialogue. We work together on so many things. We have the first African American Attorney General in a state constitutional office. We have, and who was formerly the Senate Majority Leader. We have representation at the table in our legislature and in positions of leadership, and I could go on and on and on in that regard. And so you did see a lot of policy over the last 2 sessions that I've served that have really brought forward to the table addressing these issues in all aspects of education and the judicial system, and teaching cultural competency, getting better data collection so we can have accountability and transparency to things, voting for equal rights, removing ancient discriminatory language out of everything from mortgage lending practices, right, to making sure we're teaching cultural competency in education and in healthcare. So there's a tremendous amount that we have done, but it needs to continue to be worked on even more, because when we see data, when we see that transparency, how do we respond to it? How do we act upon it? And then how do we push that out from the state level to the national level, which is a totally separate conversation, and then down to the local level at every board, having every citizen voice in those conversations around everything from those reports that we get on accountability and the way that we do things in education, the way we do things in healthcare, the way we do things in the judicial system. So what I want people to recognize is that there are so many things that have been done, that are being engaged in with our police departments, with our sheriff, within education. But then I look at the data and I see we have not gotten there yet. And I have a responsibility to look at that, to be humble about what I see in front of me, and also to have a responsibility to share with others in my spheres of influence to also look at that and say, why is that still not equitable in achievement outcomes in education? Why is it that we still see a tremendous gap when we look at who is in managerial and executive positions and positions of economic opportunity and wealth? And why do we see gaps in the judicial system, which I also teach at the Judicial College? And so we teach that implicit bias training to judges. How can we be honest and have conversations about where those disparities still exist, and how can we continue to progress them forward? And to Dr. Young's point, those conversations require people at the table. And it is not passive. It won't happen on its own. When I look from an organizational communication standpoint in the workplace and how we make sure we answer those questions of inequity at higher levels of managerial positions and executive positions, and we know that one of the things is recruitment, mentorship, right? Because instead of just hiring my neighbor's kid, and maybe I'm only ever hiring from the same pool, how am I actively engaged in reaching out and having conversations and pulling in and drawing in so that we have diverse voices at those decision-making tables? So I am grateful, I'm proud of so much work that we have done, and yet at the same time, I am fully aware that until we see changes across the board in those numbers, until I stop getting a report that says this, we're not there yet. Yeah. And we're all part of that conversation.
Yeah, thank you. We talked a little bit before we even got started, and definitely more dialogue that we were talking about having of what people can do at ground zero that's going to really begin to step into just having a massive amount of people working together to, just push for policy reform and different things like that. So definitely looking forward to that conversation.
Absolutely.
Now, Deputy Chief Tom Robinson, we brought you because we wanted to hear also about law enforcement. Of course, we know the George Floyd's incident was polarizing for law enforcement around the country, and but we have a heart to hear, from the law enforcement community, and because again, we are with you, and we want to do what we can also. As a church and as citizens in this city, to support you and to take steps with you. And you kind of touched on it a little bit before when I asked you about, what is the climate of the law enforcement community right now that you feel? And you can touch on that a little bit more if you want. But my question here for you is, do you think well, you kind of answered already, I guess. Do you think police reform is in order? And if so, what kind of reform, and how will the Reno Police Department reform?
Well, the first part of your question had to do with the George Floyd case, and I really think that there's a universal feeling among all law enforcement that it wasn't handled right, and that their actions were criminal. And so I'm glad to see that they're going to be held accountable for that. And in terms of the police reform, I don't know if the message is getting across universally. I don't know if all law enforcement organizations throughout the country are picking up on the clues that the communities are giving us, but we certainly are. And obviously there needs to be reform in deadly force policies, in use of force policies, and peer intervention. Mm. You have 4 officers there. You have 4 police officers in this case, and when one of them is doing something wrong, 3 of them should have done something to stop him.
So you actually just scratched one of my other questions I had for you, and that was, do you feel like officers are like have pledged their allegiance to like a fraternity of officers over, their sworn duty to, uphold the oath that they made? Like, is it like, again, what, I see this, it is wrong, and this will get this officer in trouble, over, again, their sworn duty, what's your thoughts on that?
I believe they have a sense of commitment and fraternity with one another. I believe that. I don't believe there's a code. It's certainly not condoned or authorized or perpetuated by police leadership. And I know every officer I talk to, they take that honor they took, or that oath they took seriously. And we have lots of examples of police officers who do the right thing, even when faced with another officer that's making a mistake. So I really don't believe that there is a secrecy among, at least not locally. And if there was, I think the community's message is loud and clear that it won't be tolerated. And I think every one of us realize that we have a duty and a responsibility to stop, excessive police conduct.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that and giving us really some perspective on the law enforcement community in that area. All right, Tiffany.
Yeah.
Could you explain systems of privilege and oppression in some of these institutionalized practice and policies that produce inequities?
I liken that to a couple of things. So I want to say to Deputy Chief's comment about the code, I'm going to push back a little bit, and not just about law enforcement, but I'm going to say agencies, organizations where there's a predominant represented group. I think there are unwritten codes all the time, right? So I'm not going to say this is about the law enforcement agency, but I think there are unspoken and unwritten codes and rules that are shared with people that they want to share them with. And so not to the Reno Police Department, but I think to structural positions. And that gets to this kind of power, privilege, and oppression, is that people that hold power share codes with the people they want to share the power with. And so when I say unwritten kind of codes and unwritten kind of things about sharing, how we define professionalism and how we have people show up, sometimes there's an unwritten thing that happens in groups and organizations, and we share them with the ones we want to benefit, right? And we keep them from the ones that we don't. And it's unwritten and it's unspoken, and I think it happens more often, and we don't see it, right? Because we are benefiting from it. That's the privilege. That's some of the entitlement, that we don't see it because we're benefiting and we're functioning. So when we think about like privilege and oppression, there are those that benefit from things and there are those that are harmed. That is the reality of it. And if we don't systematically say, I'm walking or living and functioning in a system that I'm benefiting from what's happening around me. And in order for me to bring someone alongside, in order for me to shift the conversation of privilege, I'm going to have to give up some power, right? But that means I'm going to have to acknowledge the fact that I'm holding the power. And because entitlement exists, it's not a class that you go to, it's not something that you earn, it's often placed upon people. Most people feel like, well, I don't have any power. But then when you look around the room, who's in that room? Are there people that look like you? When you read a policy, are there unspoken pieces of language in a policy, in a rule, in a guidance that impacts a certain part of the community that typically wouldn't impact you? These are the reasons why we have to shift the narrative. So when we talk about power and we talk about privilege and we talk about oppression, we've got to understand there are those that benefit and there are those that are harmed. And there's often unwritten, unspoken rules where codes are shared, right? And it's not sometimes intentionality around harming someone. It becomes pattern of practice. and there's no one there to disrupt that.
Yeah, I think on that too, that just sounds also like it's not just a, that's a human problem. Mm-hmm. Like the unspoken codes of fraternity, that's a human survival mechanism within all facets of society. So I think that's just good, and I think we have freedom as Christians to admit, like, sin permeates every aspect of who we are and also every aspect of all of our organizations. So we shouldn't be surprised that either at the top or the bottom of an organization, whether it includes race or not, that there's patterns of fraternity to try to either survive or grasp for power or to keep power. And so I think just acknowledging, like, hey, this is there and this is at play, and being able to have, like, healthy community dialogue so that we don't act according to that and neglect something that is wrong or evil even, because we have this unspoken code that we want to keep. But I think it's not just a power thing in organizations. It's a human thing, often to protect.
We talk a lot about power in my classes, and there's a great video. I've been thinking about posting it again, but just a discussion of what is power and how is it used. And power is like electricity. It's not good or bad. It just is, but it's how we use it. Do we use it for good, or do we use it for harm? And what methods do we use to gain power, and what do we do with power, to your point, to share power and to give power to the people, which and that's what this is. This is a dialogue, it's conversations, but as we look at the different ways we see power used all around us, what do we here in America have to utilize? We have the power of our voice with our First Amendment to speak, to protest, to raise an alarm when we believe something is unjust and wrong. And we have the power of the ballot to vote, and the power to reach out to our representatives and to be heard, and if they are not hearing us, to vote them out, and the power to dialogue and converse and change and present policy that is going to benefit, to move through, not just move on, to your point. And so how do we use, we as believers, how do we use power for good? And how do we use it to make sure that it is represented and shared of all peoples? Because that's America. That's what America is meant to be. It is for each and everyone. All men are created equal, with the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. How do we do that?
Yes, absolutely. That's important, and definitely we are hoping that this dialogue will begin to foster some of that we hope to have, amongst one another. I think it's appropriate. There were a couple of things mentioned. I think it's appropriate to say these definitions. One was white privilege. It's where white people have the privilege of being free from the burdens of being a racial minority. They have the freedom of not thinking about what a racial minority have to think about every day. How white people are used to non-white people not being in charge, and not a black or Asian people being in charge, and what dynamic that brings. So that's a definition around white privilege that we have. Another word that was mentioned basically in the kind of conversation was discrimination is unfair treatment of a person or group, usually because of their ethnicity, culture, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or age. And so those are just some of the definitions that I thought would be helpful during this time.
Thanks for joining us today. That's it for our racial reconciliation panel of part 2. Next week will be part 3, and that will be the last week that we're doing this. So please make it a priority to watch, and I hope it's been a blessing to your soul.